Hey there, night owls and history addicts. Tonight we're diving into something that makes your worst food poisoning look like a spa day. The slow, methodical destruction of Edward VIII, the boy king who got dealt the worst hand in Tudor history. The kid who should have been worried about acne and awkward conversations instead spent 6 years having his own immune system wage a personal war against every organ in his body. So before we embark on this journey through medical horror and royal suffering, hit that like button if you're ready for some seriously dark history. And subscribe if you've got the stomach for stories that don't end with everyone living happily ever after. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always wild to see who's brave enough to stick around for the really grim stuff. Maybe grab a cup of tea or whatever keeps you grounded, because we're about to explore what happens when biology decides to write a horror story using a 15-year-old king as the protagonist. You think your immune system is your friend. Cute. Really like thinking a cobra makes a good house pet. Edward VIII learned the hard way that sometimes your body's defense system gets its wires crossed and decides the real enemy isn't invading viruses or bacteria, it's you. Every cell, every organ, every system that keeps you breathing and thinking and being human becomes a target in a war you never signed up for and can't possibly win. So settle in, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself for a tale that makes Game of Thrones look like a Disney movie. Because sometimes the most brutal battles aren't fought on distant battlefields. They're fought inside a child's body while the world watches, helpless, as greatness gets devoured from within. You think you know death. You think you've seen suffering. Let me tell you about Edward VIII, the boy king who was supposed to save England, but instead became its most tragic footnote. Not the romantic, poetic death of a martyr. Not the swift end of a battlefield hero. This was the slow, methodical destruction of a child by the very crown he wore, wrapped in the finest silks, while his body betrayed him cell by cell. Picture this January 1547. Henry VIII, that bloated monument to excess and paranoia, finally croaks. The throne passes to his 9-year-old son Edward, a pale wisp of a boy who probably weighed less than one of his father's legs. The kid never asked for this. He was probably hoping for a pony for his birthday, not the crushing weight of Protestant England's future on his narrow shoulders. But here's the thing about power in Tudor England. It doesn't care about your age, your health, or your complete lack of interest in politics. It finds you anyway, wraps its cold fingers around your throat, and squeezes until there's nothing left but regret and royal purple. Edward was brilliant, they said. A prodigy. Could speak Latin before most kids learned to properly wipe their own noses. But intelligence in a Tudor was like being the smartest person in a burning building. Congratulations, you can see exactly how screwed you are, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. The boy king's education was handled by Cambridge scholars who treated him like a particularly promising manuscript they were trying not to smudge. Mathematics, theology, philosophy, languages, they stuffed his head full of everything except how to survive being a king. No one taught him that lesson, because honestly, most Tudor monarchs didn't survive it either. But let's talk about the real killer here, literally. Not the usual suspects you'd expect in a Tudor death story. Not poison slipped into wine by ambitious courtiers. Not a convenient falling down the stairs accident. Not even the plague. Though God knows that was always lurking around Tudor England, like an unwelcome party guest who never got the hint. No, Edward's killer was something far more insidious. Far more cruel. Something that took its time, savoured every moment of destruction, and made sure everyone could watch the show. His own immune system decided to turn against him, but not in any way the royal physicians could understand or treat. This wasn't consumption, or the sweating sickness, or any of the dramatic maladies that usually carried off royalty with some measure of dignity. This was autoimmune hepatitis, though they didn't have a name for it then. They just watched helplessly as the boy king's liver slowly poisoned him from the inside, turning his skin the colour of old parchment, and his eyes the yellow of spoiled butter. But that was just the opening act in this medical horror show. The real nightmare began when Edward developed what modern medicine would recognise as severe ulcerative colitis, complicated by what was almost certainly Crohn's disease. Picture your intestines as a garden. Now picture that garden being systematically destroyed by an army of microscopic vandals who think inflammation is an art form. Every meal became an act of torture. Every sip of water a potential trigger for hours of agony that would leave the boy king doubled over, sweating and shaking like a fever victim. But wait, there's more. Because apparently one autoimmune disaster wasn't enough for fate's taste. Edward also developed what physicians today would diagnose as juvenile dermatomyositis. His own immune system began attacking his muscles and skin, creating a rainbow of bruises and rashes that made him look like he'd been beaten with a bag of gemstones. His muscles weakened day by day, until lifting a cup became an exhausting effort that left him trembling. And here's the truly horrific part: he was aware of all of it. Every stage of deterioration, every new symptom, every fresh indignity. The boy who could debate theology in 3 languages had to watch his body become a stranger, a traitor, a prison that grew smaller and more painful each day. The court physicians were absolutely useless, of course. These were men who thought bloodletting could cure a headache, and that mixing powdered unicorn horn with wine was legitimate medicine. They looked at Edward's constellation of symptoms and decided he obviously had too much bile in his system. The solution: more bloodletting. Always more bloodletting. Because nothing says medical expertise like draining blood from someone whose immune system is already eating him alive. Dr. Butts, the king's primary physician, was convinced that Edward's problems stemmed from an excess of melancholic humours. His prescribed treatment involved purging the boy's system with increasingly violent laxatives, as if Edward's digestive tract wasn't already destroying itself quite efficiently enough. Picture a 9-year-old king, barely able to keep water down, being force-fed concoctions that would make a horse sick, all in the name of balancing his humours. Meanwhile, the Privy Council was playing their own game of musical chairs with the throne. Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector and the King's uncle, was too busy trying to consolidate his own power to notice that his nephew was slowly dying right in front of him. John Dudley, who would later become the Duke of Northumberland, was positioning himself to take over when Seymour inevitably fell from grace. These men circled the dying boy like vultures, making plans for a future they weren't sure would include him. But let's get back to the medical nightmare, because that's where the real horror lived. Edward's autoimmune conditions triggered a cascade of secondary problems that turned his body into a catalogue of suffering. The chronic inflammation damaged his kidneys, leading to periods where he couldn't urinate properly, his body swelling with retained fluids until he looked like a pale balloon in royal robes. His liver damage progressed to the point where his body couldn't process nutrients properly. The boy who should have been growing into a strong young man instead began to shrink, his frame becoming skeletal, his clothes hanging on him like fabric draped over candling. Palace staff whispered that you could see his heart beat through his chest, a visible reminder of how thin the barrier between life and death had become. The skin manifestations of his dermatomyositis were particularly cruel. Raised, purplish rashes spread across his face and hands, making him look diseased to anyone who saw him. In an age where physical appearance was believed to reflect moral character, these visible symptoms made courtiers wonder if the boy king was being punished by God for some unnamed sin. The irony was devastating. England's most pious king looked like he was marked for damnation. Sleep became impossible. The inflammation in his digestive tract created constant, gnawing pain that felt like someone was slowly shredding his insides with broken glass. But lying flat made his fluid retention worse, so he had to sleep propped up on pillows, trying to find some position that didn't make everything worse. Palace servants reported hearing him crying through the night, not the loud wails of a child throwing a tantrum, but the quiet, exhausted sobs of someone who had run out of hope. His appetite disappeared entirely. The sight of food made him nauseous, but not eating made his weakness worse. The royal kitchens, accustomed to preparing elaborate feasts, found themselves trying to create meals that a dying child might be able to keep down. Thin broths, small pieces of bread soaked in milk, anything that might provide nutrition without triggering another bout of violent cramping and diarrhea. And through all of this, Edward had to maintain the facade of being a king. Privy Council meetings couldn't be cancelled just because he could barely sit upright. Foreign ambassadors still expected audiences, even when Edward's hands shook so badly he could barely hold a pen to sign documents. The machinery of government ground on, indifferent to the fact that its central figure was slowly disintegrating. The boy tried to rule, tried to fulfill his father's expectations even as his body betrayed him at every turn. He would sit through meetings with sweat beading on his forehead from the effort of staying upright, his jaw clenched against waves of nausea, his mind fighting through the fog of chronic pain to focus on matters of state. Imagine trying to make decisions about foreign policy when every breath feels like drowning, when your own skin feels like it's on fire. But the cruelest part wasn't the physical suffering, it was the isolation. No one could really understand what he was going through. The physicians spouted nonsense about humours and temperaments. The courtiers saw weakness and whispered about succession. The Privy Council saw an obstacle to their ambitions. Even his tutors, who genuinely cared about him, couldn't comprehend the magnitude of his suffering because they'd never seen anything like it. Edward became a prisoner in his own body, watching helplessly as everything that made him who he was slowly disappeared. His legendary intelligence remained sharp, which made everything worse because he could analyze his own decline with scholarly precision. He knew he was dying. He knew the treatments weren't working. He knew that everyone around him was lying when they promised he would get better. The boy who had been raised to believe he was chosen by God to rule England began to wonder if God had actually chosen him to suffer as an example to others. In his private moments, when the pain was particularly bad, he questioned everything he'd been taught about divine providence and royal destiny. If he was truly God's anointed, why was he being tortured so methodically? His religious faith, which had been carefully cultivated by Protestant tutors who wanted to ensure England's break with Rome would be permanent, became complicated by his physical agony. Edward had been taught that suffering was either punishment for sin or a test of faith. But what sin could a 9-year-old king possibly have committed to deserve such elaborate torment? And if this was a test, what exactly was God trying to prove? The progression of his illnesses followed a pattern that would have been familiar to modern immunologists, but was completely inexplicable to Tudor physicians. Periods of relative stability followed by sudden, dramatic deteriorations that left everyone scrambling to adjust treatments that weren't working anyway. His liver function would improve slightly, giving false hope, then crash again as his immune system launched another assault on his own tissues. During one particularly bad flare, up in late 1552, Edward's abdomen became so distended with fluid that he looked pregnant. The pressure against his diaphragm made breathing difficult, turning every breath into conscious effort. Palace physicians decided the solution was to puncture his abdomen with a heated needle to drain the fluid, a procedure performed without anesthesia on a 13-year-old boy who was already in agony. The treatment was about as successful as you'd expect from Tudor medicine. The wound became infected, adding sepsis to Edward's growing collection of medical problems. His fever spiked so high that he became delirious, babbling about seeing his father's ghost and calling for his mother, who had died shortly after his birth. The infection spread through his bloodstream, creating new sites of inflammation in organs that had previously been unaffected. But Edward's immune system had apparently decided that half measures were for weaklings. As if inflammatory bowel disease, autoimmune hepatitis, and dermatomyositis weren't enough, he developed what modern doctors would recognize as autoimmune nephritis. His kidneys joined the rebellion against his own body. His urine became dark and bloody, and his legs swelled with edema until he could barely walk. The boy who had once been carried on the shoulders of courtiers, celebrating his coronation, now had to be carried everywhere, because standing was too exhausting. His breathing became laboured as fluid accumulated around his lungs. Every system in his body was failing simultaneously, like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of destruction. And still, the court demanded he perform his royal duties. Foreign ambassadors needed to see him to report back to their own monarchs about England's stability. Parliament required his presence for important votes. The Protestant Reformation couldn't afford to pause, just because its figurehead was dying inch by inch. So Edward sat on his throne, propped up with cushions to hide his weakness, his face painted with cosmetics to disguise his yellow pallor, performing the role of a king while his body dissolved around him. Courtiers who remembered him as a bright, energetic child now saw a gaunt spectre whose clothes hung on him like burial shrouds. His voice, once clear and strong as he debated with his tutors, became weak and breathy. Speaking for more than a few minutes left him exhausted and coughing, sometimes bringing up blood that he tried to hide in handkerchiefs. The boy who had been groomed to give stirring speeches about England's Protestant destiny could barely whisper his way through a prayer. The psychological torture was almost worse than the physical suffering. Edward had been raised to believe that kings were different from ordinary people, that royal blood carried special obligations and special protections. The realization that he was just as vulnerable to pain and death as any peasant shattered his understanding of himself and his place in the world. He began having nightmares about his father's ghost, dreams where Henry VIII appeared as the bloated corpse he'd become, demanding to know why Edward was failing as a king, why he couldn't be strong enough to rule England properly. The boy would wake up screaming, covered in sweat, his already weakened body racked with tremors that took hours to subside. His tutors tried to maintain some semblance of normal education. But how do you teach Latin grammar to a child whose own body is trying to kill him? How do you discuss philosophy with someone who's living through the practical reality of undeserved suffering? Edward's intellectual gifts, which had once been his pride, became another source of torment as he used his analytical mind to catalogue every new symptom, every sign of deterioration. The court's attempts to maintain normalcy became increasingly grotesque. They still held elaborate ceremonies where Edward was expected to participate, still planned celebrations for his birthday and religious holidays. Picture a dying child being dressed in heavy ceremonial robes he could barely support, forced to smile and wave at crowds who had no idea they were looking at a walking corpse. His personal servants, who saw him at his worst moments, were sworn to secrecy about the true extent of his condition. They watched him struggle to eat a few spoonfuls of broth, helped him to the chamber pot when his digestive system rebelled against whatever meager nourishment he'd managed to consume, cleaned up the blood he coughed up during particularly bad nights. These servants, mostly young people themselves, developed their own form of trauma from watching their king suffer so helplessly. They knew that Edward's death would probably mean their own dismissal or worse, depending on who ended up on the throne, but many of them had grown genuinely fond of the intelligent, gentle boy who tried so hard to be brave in the face of unimaginable pain. The political implications of Edward's illness created their own layer of suffering. Every time he had a bad episode, rumours flew about his imminent death, causing instability in government and panic in financial markets. Protestant leaders throughout Europe watched nervously, knowing that Edward's death would likely mean the restoration of Catholicism under his half, Sister Mary, undoing everything they'd worked for since Henry VIII's break with Rome. Edward was acutely aware of these political pressures. He knew that his death wouldn't just be a personal tragedy, it would reshape the religious and political landscape of England for generations. The weight of that responsibility, combined with his physical agony, created a crushing psychological burden that would have broken most adults, let alone a teenager who should have been worrying about nothing more serious than his studies. In early 1553, as Edward's condition deteriorated beyond any hope of recovery, John Dudley, now Duke of Northumberland and the power behind the throne, hatched a desperate plan. He convinced the dying king to alter the succession by passing both of his half-sisters in favour of Lady Jane Grey, Dudley's daughter-in-law. The idea was to maintain Protestant control and, not coincidentally, keep Dudley's family in power. Edward, delirious with pain and fever, agreed to sign the document that would plunge England into civil war. His signature, normally precise and scholarly, was barely legible, a shaky scrawl that looked like it had been written during an earthquake. This would be one of his last official acts as king, condemning his country to chaos because he was too sick to understand the full implications of what he was signing. But let's get back to the medical horror show, because Edward's story was far from over. His immune system, apparently unsatisfied with the destruction it had already caused, launched what would be its final, most devastating assault. The autoimmune process spread to his central nervous system, causing what modern doctors would recognize as autoimmune encephalitis. His brain began to swell as his own antibodies attacked his neural tissue. The boy, who had once been able to recite complex theological arguments, began having trouble remembering simple words. He would start sentences and lose track of what he was trying to say, his brilliant mind fragmenting as inflammation damaged the very organ that had defined his identity. Seizures began, small at first, brief moments where his eyes would roll back and his body would stiffen slightly. But they progressed quickly, becoming violent convulsions that left him unconscious for hours afterwards. Each seizure seemed to take a little more of his cognitive function, like someone was slowly erasing a masterpiece one brushstroke at a time. The courtiers who had once marveled at Edward's precocious intelligence now watched in horror as he struggled with tasks that should have been automatic. He would try to sign documents and forget how to form letters. He would look at people he'd known for years and not recognize their faces. The sharp, analytical mind that had impressed scholars throughout Europe was dissolving like sugar in rain. His vision began to fail as the inflammatory process affected his optic nerves. The world became increasingly blurry, then dark, until he was essentially blind, dependent on others to guide him through the palace that had been his home since childhood. Imagine being trapped in a body that was systematically shutting down, while also being trapped in darkness, unable to see the faces of the people trying to help you. His hearing followed his vision into darkness. The boy who had loved music, who had played the lute and sung in the palace chapel, gradually lost the ability to hear the sounds around him. Conversations became impossible. The isolation that had been psychological became complete. Edward was alone with his pain in a world of silence and shadows. But his body wasn't finished with him yet. The autoimmune process that had destroyed his liver, intestines, kidneys, muscles, and brain decided to attack his heart as well. Autoimmune myocarditis caused his heart muscle to become inflamed and weak, unable to pump blood effectively. His already pale skin took on a bluish tinge as his circulation failed. His breathing became increasingly labored as his heart struggled to maintain circulation and his lungs filled with fluid. Every breath was a conscious effort, a battle against the weight of fluid that was slowly drowning him from the inside. The boy who had once run through the palace gardens now couldn't manage the energy to lift his head from his pillow. By June 1553, Edward was essentially comatose, maintained in a twilight state between life and death. His body had become a collection of failing organs, held together by willpower, and the desperate ministrations of physicians who had no idea what they were fighting. His pulse was barely detectable, his breathing shallow and irregular, his skin cold and waxy. But even then, his suffering wasn't over. The autoimmune process had damaged his nervous system in such a way that he could still experience pain, even though he couldn't respond to it. Medical researchers today understand that consciousness can persist even in seemingly comatose patients, meaning Edward may have been aware of every moment of his final agony while being unable to communicate or escape. His final weeks were spent in a state that can only be described as living death. His body temperature fluctuated wildly as his damaged hypothalamus lost the ability to regulate heat. Sometimes he would burn with fever, his skin hot to the touch, his breathing rapid and shallow. Other times he would become hypothermic, his lips turning blue, his body shivering uncontrollably despite being buried under layers of blankets. The palace became a house of horrors disguised as a seat of power. Servants whispered about the sounds coming from the king's chambers, not screams, which would have been almost merciful, but the quiet, constant sounds of a body slowly shutting down, the wet rattle of fluid in damaged lungs, the irregular heartbeat that could be heard through his chest wall, the soft moaning that escaped his lips during moments of semi-consciousness. His personal physicians, Dr. Butts and Dr. Wendy, maintained their vigil despite knowing there was nothing they could do. They had watched this brilliant child transform into something that barely resembled a human being, and their professional pride had been replaced by simple horror at the magnitude of suffering they were witnessing. On July 6, 1553, Edward's heart finally gave up its struggle. But even his death wasn't quick or peaceful. His heart rhythm became increasingly irregular, beating frantically for several minutes, then stopping for long periods before starting again. His breathing became erratic, deep gasps followed by long pauses, where those watching thought he had finally died, only to have him suddenly inhale again. The actual moment of death was almost anticlimactic after 6 years of gradually increasing torment. His breathing simply became shallower and shallower until it stopped, his heartbeat fading to nothing, his body finally finding the peace that had been denied to him for so long. Edward VI died at Greenwich Palace at the age of 15, having ruled for 6 years and lived through more suffering than most people experience in a full lifetime. But the horror didn't end with his death. His body, ravaged by years of autoimmune destruction, had become so damaged that it began decomposing almost immediately. The embalming process, primitive by any standard, couldn't preserve tissues that had been systematically destroyed by inflammation. Within hours of his death, his body began to bloat and discolor, making him unrecognizable as the pale but dignified boy who had tried so hard to be a good king. The state funeral became a race against time as palace officials tried to maintain some dignity while Edward's body continued to deteriorate. The elaborate ceremonies that had been planned for England's Protestant king had to be abbreviated because the corpse couldn't be displayed for the traditional viewing periods. Even in death, Edward's suffering continued as his physical form became too horrific to be seen by the public who had loved him. The political chaos that followed his death fulfilled his worst fears about the consequences of his illness. Lady Jane Grey, the innocent teenager who had been thrust onto the throne by his altered succession document, was executed after 9 days of nominal rule. Mary Tudor, his Catholic half-sister, took the throne and immediately began the process of returning England to the Roman Catholic Church, executing hundreds of Protestants in the process. Everything Edward had believed in, everything he had tried to protect despite his overwhelming physical suffering, was swept away within months of his death. The Protestant Reformation that had defined his reign and his identity was reversed. The careful political balances he had tried to maintain collapsed into civil war and religious persecution. Even his burial became complicated by the religious upheavals his death had triggered. Mary's government was unsure how to handle the funeral of a Protestant king, eventually settling on a compromise ceremony that satisfied no one and honoured nothing. Edward was buried at Westminster Abbey in a tomb that was notably simple compared to those of other English monarchs, as if the country wanted to forget the tragic boy who had tried so hard to rule despite impossible circumstances. The physicians who had attended Edward during his final illness were haunted by their complete inability to help him. Dr. Butts, who had served the royal family for decades, never fully recovered from watching the brilliant child suffer so helplessly. He died less than 2 years after Edward, reportedly from what contemporaries described as a broken heart, though it was probably the stress-related illness that comes from watching someone you care about die slowly and painfully while being unable to help. Dr. Wendy lived longer, but was forever changed by his experience with Edward's case. He became obsessed with studying what he called wasting diseases, and spent the rest of his career trying to understand what had killed the boy king. His notes, preserved in medical archives, reveal a man tormented by his failure to save a patient he had grown to love like a son. The servants who had cared for Edward during his illness were scattered after his death, many of them carrying their own psychological scars from what they had witnessed. Several reportedly suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, experiencing nightmares and flashbacks related to their memories of the dying king's suffering. Contemporary accounts of Edward's death, written by courtiers and foreign ambassadors, consistently describe it as one of the most horrible things they had ever witnessed. These were men who had lived through the violent reigns of Henry VIII and had seen executions, battles, and plagues. Yet they were traumatized by watching a child die, slowly from diseases they couldn't understand or treat. The tragedy of Edward VI extends beyond his personal suffering to encompass the broader implications of his death. Here was a genuinely good person, an intelligent and well-intentioned ruler who wanted to serve his country well, destroyed not by human malice or political intrigue, but by the random cruelty of autoimmune disease. His death serves as a reminder that neither royal blood nor divine appointment provides protection from the fundamental vulnerability of human existence. Modern medical understanding makes Edward's story even more heartbreaking because we now know that many of his conditions could have been treated, if not cured, with proper immunosuppressive therapy. Corticosteroids, immunomodulators, and targeted biologics could have controlled the autoimmune processes that killed him. The boy who died in agony because his own immune system turned against him could have lived a normal life if he had been born 5 centuries later. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Edward's death is how completely it was forgotten by history. Most people, if they remember him at all, think of him as the sickly boy king who died young and caused problems with the succession. The magnitude of his suffering, the courage he showed in trying to rule despite overwhelming physical pain, and the genuine goodness of his character have been overshadowed by the more dramatic stories of his father and sisters. Edward VI deserves to be remembered not just as a footnote in Tudor history, but as a young person who faced unimaginable suffering with dignity and tried to do his duty even when his own body was torturing him every moment of every day. His death was not the clean, dramatic end of a fairy tale prince, but the messy, horrible, drawn-out destruction of a real human being who deserved better than the hand fate dealt him. In the end, Edward's story serves as a reminder that suffering is not noble or redemptive or character-building. It's just suffering, random, cruel, and utterly indifferent to the worth or innocence of its victims. The boy king of England died badly, not because he deserved it, or because it served some greater purpose, but because sometimes biology is simply, pointlessly vicious. And that, perhaps, is the most horrific thing of all, not that Edward suffered so terribly, but that his suffering was ultimately meaningless, a cosmic accident that destroyed a good person for no reason at all. In a world that wants to believe in justice and meaning, Edward VI's death stands as a stark reminder that sometimes there is no reason, no purpose, no redemption, just pain and loss, and the stubborn refusal of a good heart to stop beating until it finally has no choice. The ripple effects of Edward's agonizing death continued long after his body was sealed in its tomb. The physicians who had attended him became cautionary tales themselves, their careers haunted by their complete failure to understand or treat the complex autoimmune cascade that had destroyed their patient. They had watched helplessly as the most advanced medical knowledge of their time proved utterly inadequate against diseases that wouldn't be properly understood for another 4 centuries. Dr. Butts, in particular, never recovered from the experience. He had served 3 monarchs and seen countless patients through various ailments, but nothing had prepared him for watching a child's immune system methodically destroy every organ in his body. The old physician began questioning everything he thought he knew about medicine, spending his final years obsessively studying Edward's case and filling journals with desperate theories about what had gone wrong. His notes, preserved in the Royal College of Physicians' archives, make for heartbreaking reading. Page after page of increasingly frantic attempts to understand why a healthy child had suddenly begun wasting away despite every treatment they tried. Butts documented Edward's symptoms with scientific precision, but his personal anguish bleeds through the clinical language. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to healing, confronted with a patient he couldn't save despite having unlimited resources and the desperate motivation of knowing that England's future hung in the balance. The other physicians scattered after Edward's death, many abandoning medicine entirely. Dr. Wendy, who had been present for some of Edward's worst episodes, reportedly told colleagues that he never wanted to see another child patient again. The trauma of watching Edward's prolonged deterioration had broken something in these learned men, shattering their confidence in their profession and their understanding of the human body. But the psychological damage extended far beyond the medical professionals. The servants who had cared for Edward during his illness carried their own invisible wounds. Margaret Brown, who had been one of his personal attendants, never spoke publicly about what she had witnessed, but her family reported that she suffered from terrible nightmares for years afterward. She would wake up screaming about blood and seizures, reliving the worst moments of Edward's decline. Thomas Ashby, a young page who had helped carry Edward to and from his sickbed during his final months, developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorder. He became terrified of illness in any form, obsessively washing his hands and avoiding sick people with a paranoia that made normal social interaction impossible. The sight of a child coughing or running a fever would send him into panic attacks that left him shaking and unable to function. These weren't weak people or individuals prone to hysteria. These were Tudor courtiers, hardened by lives in a violent age where death was commonplace and expected. They had seen executions, battlefield casualties, and victims of plague without flinching. But there was something uniquely horrifying about Edward's death that traumatized even these experienced witnesses to human suffering. Perhaps it was the combination of innocence and prolonged agony that made his case so psychologically damaging to observe. Edward had been a genuinely good person, kind to his servants, devoted to his studies, trying his best to be a worthy king despite impossible circumstances. Watching someone so fundamentally decent suffer so extensively violated every assumption about fairness and divine justice that these people had been raised to believe. Or perhaps it was the medical mystery itself that made Edward's death so disturbing. When someone dies from plague or battle wounds or even poison, there's a clear cause and effect that human minds can process and accept. But Edward's illness defied explanation, creating a sense of helplessness and cosmic uncertainty that challenged everyone's understanding of how the world was supposed to work. The foreign ambassadors who had witnessed Edward's decline carried news of his horrific death back to their home countries, where it became a cautionary tale about the fragility of royal succession and the dangers of putting too much faith in any single ruler. The Venetian ambassador, who had seen Edward during one of his worst episodes, wrote to the Doge that he had never witnessed such suffering in a human being, and that it had shaken his faith in divine providence. The French ambassador reported that Edward's death had been so horrible that even hardened English courtiers were refusing to discuss it openly, as if speaking about what they had witnessed might somehow curse them with similar suffering. These diplomatic reports spread throughout European courts, creating a sense of unease about the stability of England and the reliability of Protestant succession. But perhaps most tragically, Edward's suffering became a propaganda tool in the religious conflicts that followed his death. Catholic supporters of Mary Tudor claimed that his horrible end was divine punishment for England's break with Rome, proof that God disapproved of Protestant reforms. Protestant defenders countered that Edward's suffering was a test of faith, similar to Job's trials, and that his steadfast devotion despite physical agony proved his righteousness. Both sides were wrong, of course. Edward's death had nothing to do with divine approval or disapproval. It was simply the result of a malfunctioning immune system that attacked healthy tissue with the same vigor it should have reserved for actual threats. But in an age that interpreted everything through religious lenses, his meaningless suffering was transformed into theological ammunition for political battles he had tried to avoid. The irony is devastating. Edward, who had spent his brief life trying to find middle ground between competing religious factions, became a symbol of sectarian division after his death. His genuine piety and scholarly approach to theology were forgotten in favor of simple political narratives that reduced his complex character to convenient propaganda points. Even his intellectual legacy was distorted by the circumstances of his death. Edward had been a remarkably sophisticated thinker for his age, producing theological writings that impressed adult scholars and demonstrating a nuanced understanding of political theory that suggested he might have become one of England's ablest monarchs if he had lived. But his reputation became overshadowed by his physical weakness, as if his diseased body somehow diminished the value of his mental achievements. Modern historians have begun to rehabilitate Edward's reputation, recognizing him as a bright, conscientious ruler who faced impossible challenges with remarkable maturity. But for centuries after his death, he was remembered primarily as the sickly boy king whose weakness had destabilized England and opened the door to religious persecution under Mary Tudor. This posthumous injustice adds another layer to the tragedy of Edward's life. Not only did he suffer physical agony that would have broken most adults, but his memory was dishonored by people who used his death to justify their own political agendas. The boy who had tried so hard to be a good king was remembered as a failure, not because of anything he had done wrong, but because his immune system had betrayed him at the worst possible historical moment. The medical knowledge that might have saved Edward existed in theoretical form. Ancient Greek physicians had described autoimmune-like conditions, and there were scattered reports of similar cases throughout medieval medical literature. But this knowledge was fragmented, buried in texts that few physicians had access to, and mixed with so much superstition and misinformation that it was essentially useless for practical treatment. If Edward had been born just a few decades later, during the scientific revolution, his case might have been studied more systematically. Scientists like William Harvey, who discovered blood circulation, might have recognized the patterns in his symptoms and developed more effective treatments. The boy who died from medical ignorance was tantalizingly close to an era when his conditions might have been understood and managed. But timing, like everything else in Edward's story, worked against him. He lived in the last generation before scientific medicine began to emerge, dying just decades before physicians started using systematic observation and experimentation to understand disease processes. His death was part of the final tragedy of medieval medicine. All the good intentions and dedicated effort in the world couldn't overcome fundamental misunderstandings about how the human body actually worked. The psychological impact of Edward's death on his immediate family was complicated by the political realities of Tudor succession. Mary Tudor, who had watched her half-brother suffer from a distance while maneuvering for the throne, reportedly felt genuine grief at his death despite the political advantages it brought her. She had loved Edward as a brother, even while disagreeing with everything he represented religiously and politically. But Mary's grief was mixed with anger at the Protestant faction that had controlled Edward's reign and, in her view, had contributed to his suffering by forcing him to participate in heretical religious practices that had drawn divine punishment. This complicated emotional response helped fuel the violent persecution of Protestants that marked her own reign, as if she could somehow avenge Edward's suffering by punishing those she held responsible for leading him astray. Elizabeth Tudor, still a teenager when Edward died, was traumatized by witnessing her brother's prolonged agony, but also terrified by its political implications. She had seen what happened to rulers who were perceived as weak or illegitimate, and Edward's visible suffering had made him appear vulnerable in ways that invited political challenge. Elizabeth's later obsession with projecting an image of strength and health was partly a response to watching her brother's weakness become a political liability. The servants and courtiers who had formed emotional attachments to Edward found themselves in an impossible position after his death. Expressing too much grief for the Protestant king might be seen as disloyalty to the new Catholic regime, but showing too little seemed like betrayal of a child who had earned their genuine affection. Many solved this dilemma by simply refusing to discuss Edward at all, creating a conspiracy of silence around his memory that contributed to his historical obscurity. Palace staff developed superstitions around the rooms where Edward had suffered his worst episodes. Servants reported strange sounds and unexplained cold spots in areas where the boy king had endured particularly bad seizures or episodes of pain. Whether these phenomena were real or psychosomatic manifestations of collective trauma, they created an atmosphere of unease that lingered in the royal residences for years after Edward's death. Greenwich Palace, where Edward had died, became particularly associated with his suffering. Later monarchs avoided using it as a primary residence, and staff complained of disturbing dreams when they slept in rooms near the king's former chambers. The palace that had once been a symbol of royal power became a monument to royal vulnerability, a reminder that even divine right couldn't protect against the random cruelties of biology. The financial cost of Edward's illness was staggering, though it paled in comparison to the human cost. The royal treasury had been drained by payments to physicians, purchases of exotic medicines, and the expense of maintaining a court around a monarch who was increasingly unable to fulfill his ceremonial duties. Foreign drugs and treatments had been imported at enormous expense, none of them effective, but all of them representing desperate attempts to save England's Protestant future. These financial pressures had political implications as well. The cost of Edward's medical care had forced the government to raise taxes and sell crown lands, creating resentment among taxpayers who saw their money being spent on treatments that clearly weren't working. The economic strain contributed to the political instability that followed Edward's death, as various factions blamed each other for the fiscal irresponsibility that had weakened England's finances during a crucial transition period. But perhaps most heartbreakingly, Edward himself had been aware of these costs and had worried about the burden his illness was placing on the realm he was supposed to protect. In his clearer moments, he had questioned whether the expense of his treatments was justified when the money could have been used for more practical purposes. The boy, who should have been focused on his studies and his health instead, carried the psychological weight of knowing that his suffering was bankrupting his kingdom. His personal writings from his final years, preserved in the British Museum, reveal a young man grappling with questions that would have challenged experienced philosophers. How could a just God allow such suffering? What was the purpose of pain that served no apparent function? How could he justify the resources being spent on his failing body when his subjects needed relief from taxation and economic hardship? These theological and ethical struggles added yet another dimension to Edward's suffering. The physical pain was terrible enough, but the intellectual and spiritual crisis that accompanied his illness created a form of existential agony that was perhaps even more devastating. Edward had been raised to believe that kingship was a divine appointment that came with both privileges and responsibilities. His illness forced him to confront the possibility that either God was punishing him for unknown sins, or that the entire framework of divine monarchy was a comforting lie. The boy who had once confidently debated theological fine points with Cambridge scholars found himself questioning the most basic assumptions about divine justice and royal legitimacy. His faith, which had been a source of strength and identity, became another source of torment as he struggled to reconcile his beliefs with his experience of seemingly random, purposeless suffering. These spiritual struggles were made worse by the conflicting advice he received from religious advisors. Protestant theologians assured him that his suffering was either a test of faith or preparation for heavenly glory. Catholic sympathizers whispered that his pain was punishment for England's break with Rome and could be relieved through proper religious observance. Edward, in his weakened state, was susceptible to both interpretations, creating a cycle of spiritual anxiety that compounded his physical distress. The political vultures circling Edward's deathbed were perhaps the most disgusting aspect of his final months. Men who should have been focused on helping a suffering child instead spent their time positioning themselves for the power vacuum that would follow his death. John Dudley's manipulation of the dying king into changing the succession was just the most obvious example of how Edward's vulnerability was exploited by ambitious courtiers. But Dudley wasn't alone in his opportunism. Every major political figure in Edward's court was simultaneously playing multiple games, expressing concern for the king's health while secretly making plans for various succession scenarios. These men had sworn oaths of loyalty to Edward, but their actions showed that they viewed him primarily as an obstacle to their own ambitions, rather than as a human being deserving of compassion and protection. Edward, despite his youth and illness, was painfully aware of this political maneuvering. He could see the calculation in the eyes of men who claimed to serve him, could sense the false notes in their expressions of concern for his welfare. The knowledge that he was surrounded by people who were essentially waiting for him to die added a profound sense of isolation to his physical suffering. The boy who should have been able to trust in the loyalty and affection of his courtiers instead had to navigate a treacherous political landscape while battling diseases that were destroying his body and mind. Every decision he made was scrutinized for signs of weakness that could be exploited. Every moment of vulnerability was assessed for its political implications. This constant vigilance was exhausting for someone in perfect health, but for Edward, already weakened by multiple autoimmune conditions, it represented an additional burden that may have hastened his decline. The stress of maintaining political awareness while suffering chronic pain and neurological deterioration created a feedback loop that made both problems worse. Even his attempts to prepare for death were complicated by political considerations. Edward wanted to make arrangements for the religious settlement he had worked to establish, but any such preparations were interpreted as admission of defeat by physicians who were still claiming they could cure him. He wanted to reconcile with his Catholic sister Mary, but Protestant advisors warned that such gestures might be seen as repudiation of the Reformed faith. The dying boy was trapped between his personal desires for peace and reconciliation and the political necessities of maintaining Protestant unity in the face of Catholic restoration. He couldn't even approach his own death with dignity, because every decision was filtered through the lens of religious and political conflict. In his final weeks, as consciousness became intermittent and communication nearly impossible, Edward was finally freed from these political pressures. But by then, the damage was done. His brief life had been consumed, not just by physical suffering, but by the impossible demands of being a symbol rather than simply being allowed to be a sick child who needed care and comfort. The aftermath of Edward's death proved that his worst fears about political instability were well founded. The succession crisis he had tried to prevent through his altered will erupted into exactly the kind of religious and political chaos he had dreaded. Lady Jane Grey, the innocent girl who had been thrust onto the throne by Dudley's ambitions, was executed after 9 days of nominal rule. Mary Tudor's accession led to the persecution and execution of hundreds of Protestants, undoing the religious settlement Edward had worked to preserve. The England that emerged from this turmoil was fundamentally different from the one Edward had tried to rule. The moderate Protestant settlement he had envisioned was replaced by violent religious extremism on both sides. The careful political balances he had attempted to maintain collapsed into sectarian warfare. The humanistic learning he had promoted gave way to ideological rigidity and persecution. Everything Edward VI had lived for, everything he had suffered to protect, was swept away within months of his death. The boy, who had endured years of agony in service to his kingdom, saw his legacy destroyed almost immediately by the very people who had claimed to serve his interests. The irony is so complete it feels almost scripted. The king who had sacrificed his childhood, his health, and ultimately his life for England watched his country tear itself apart over the very succession he had tried to stabilize. And in the end, that may be the most horrific aspect of Edward's story. Not just that he suffered terribly, not just that he died young, but that his suffering accomplished nothing. The diseases that tortured him for 6 years, the political pressures that denied him any chance of a normal childhood, the desperate medical treatments that only added to his agony, all of it was ultimately pointless. Edward VI died as he had lived in his final years, in pain. Alone despite being surrounded by people, and haunted by the knowledge that his best efforts weren't enough to save either himself or his kingdom. His death stands as a monument to the fundamental unfairness of existence, a reminder that good intentions and noble character provide no protection against the random cruelties of biology and the calculating ambitions of those who mistake power for purpose.